What's up, everybody? Hopefully, you guys are doing good as always. Today, we have a very exciting game that highlights the importance of having double bishops on two very powerful diagonals aimed at your opponent's king. This was a game played between Zoltan Almasi and Alexander Khalifman. Zoltan has the white pieces. It was played in 1997. Let's begin. So we have e4, e5, knight to f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, the Roy Lopez opening. We have a6, bishop to a4, knight to f6, and white castles. Notice that you're not blundering the pawn on e4 because if black takes, rook to e1 wins back the pawn on e5 once the knight moves. You can obviously take the pawn on e5, which is why in this position, rather than taking on e4, we have bishop to e7. Black also wanting to castle pretty early. Here we have rook to e1 and b5, bishop to b3, and black castles. And now c3, preparing the d4 push. Which will, be a great way for white to get a lot of control in the center. That being said, c3 does also come with a very big disadvantage, which is the knight can no longer come to c3, which means that the light squares in the center, black has more control over them because the knight usually controls those squares, and this comes into effect later in the game. As you see, we see d5, and suddenly there's a knight here over on d5, and although black did give away a pawn and white might be better, white does have a very nicely cemented knight here on d5, and because of the fact that, again, the knight cannot come to c3, this knight is a very powerful piece, and it's probably not going to get traded off because this bishop here, it's aimed at the king. It's a very powerful piece, and you don't want to give away your double bishops that easily. Even though there's a very nicely cemented knight here, you don't necessarily want to give away that double bishop advantage. Here, after d3, this does give black the amazing opportunity to play bishop to d6, hitting the rook, but more importantly, placing the bishop on a beautiful diagonal. And because this does come with tempo, after the rook moves back, queen to h4, and Alexander is going for a very quick checkmate and a very nice attack here. So obviously, there is the threat of checkmate, and whenever you're getting attacked and you haven't moved one of these pieces, or one of these pawns rather, usually h3 is the ideal pawn to move. And the reason being, with h3 you still control the light squares and the dark squares, which means that you have overall more control. That being said, h3 does not work here because of bishop takes h3, g takes h3, queen takes h3, and black just has a beautiful attack here. The knight can take, you can trade, but in the end of the day, after the queen checks on h3, the king moves to g1, a rook to e8 hits the queen, and the queen obviously has a very important job of maintaining the second rank, and so once the queen has to move away, there is going to be checkmate here, and in general, black is just having a beautiful attack. And that's why h3 here does not work because of the sacrifice, which means that g3 is white's best option to defend. But of course, this does come with the downside, unlike h3, where you only control the dark squares, and therefore all of the light squares are very weak here, which is why queen to h3, looking to maybe, with the help of a bishop, attack here on g2, and once again, the light squares are very weak here. So this bishop coming to b7 is something that black is going to look to do, even though, it seems like this diagonal is quite closed off. In chess, everything changes very quickly, which is why a bishop putting a bishop on b7 is a very powerful maneuver for the bishop. Here we have rook to e4, maybe looking to get the rook here. It comes with tempo, so the queen has to move back, and then the rook maybe has the ability to attack with white, and maybe this is a way for white to get some counterattack on the other king, on black's king, that is, which is why here the queen moved back before the rook managed to maybe win some tempo. And in this position, the knight gets developed, and once again, the bishop wants to come over here to b7, and although, again, the diagonal seems closed off, it's very easy to open up diagonals like this, as you're going to see here, which is a very important lesson from this game. Don't be scared to put a bishop on a diagonal where it has potential later in the game. If there were maybe 3 pawns here stacked like this for black, then that's a different story, because that's very hard. But when you only have maybe 1 pawn, you have a lot of potential for that bishop to get a lot of life later in the game, so you shouldn't be scared to put a bishop on a place where, for the most part, it looks kind of closed in, because later, again, it can come to life. We have queen to f1, and yeah, c5 in an effort to open up this diagonal for the bishop, again, taking advantage of the light squares here next to the king that are very weak now. We have king moving to h8, getting out of the diagonal of this bishop potentially, and that might be important because later the knight wants to move out of here. So this bishop can also maybe come to life, which is why, again, you maybe want to get out of this diagonal here. So, in fact, after a4, going for maybe a counterattack this time on the queen side, black decides to ignore this and again move the knight out of the way for this bishop. And now knight to f4. Notice you cannot take because of this weakened structure here. Queen coming to g4 check, followed by queen takes on g2 mate. Is obviously the threat, which is why, again, you cannot take the knight here. And because of the fact that you cannot take, this knight on d5 manages to come very nicely to h3, which is a great square for it. So the knight manages to travel to h3 because, again, black does not have the chance to take. The knight comes to e4 for white, trying to get in the way of this bishop. And from white, we actually see king to h1. Now, immediately when a move like this is made, you have to realize that the bishop is now aimed at the king. And this allows in the future for possibly a move like f5, which will, of course, win the knight because, again, the knight cannot move, which is why in this position, after we see c4 and takes, knight takes on f2, followed by f5 is a wonderful find for black here, opening up the position, which allows these two bishops and queen to be a lot more free and a lot more powerful. And generally, the more closed in the position, the less your bishops have the freedom to attack, which is why if you have bishops, and black definitely has some very dangerous bishops and queens here, if you have that, you definitely want to open up the position, which is exactly what black does here. The bishop comes to e3, and now a beautiful queen to h3 looking to attack. And it might seem like black gives away the bishop. In fact, here, Zoltan does indeed take the bishop. But this is actually a horrible move for white here, because now notice that you have this beautiful idea, rook to f2, threatening checkmate. So after bishop takes, you have e3 coming with check, and here you see the power of the double bishops. You can even afford to sacrifice one of them for the other one to come to life very powerfully. And here the best move is actually just getting in the way, because after bishop takes, pawn takes, you don't actually have that bishop anymore to attack, because anything else really leads to checkmate. So you have to sacrifice your queen here. And then after black takes, even though material, if you look at material, it doesn't seem like black has a massive advantage. If you look at where the pieces are placed, black certainly has a great advantage. The rook can come into play, and with the help of maybe some pawns maybe being pushed later, yeah, black has a beautiful way to attack, and black's pieces are a lot more active. So here we have rook to f1. Obviously, you need to defend that pawn here. It was attacking your rook on e1. And now the other rook comes into play with rook to f8, not only defending the pawn, but also maybe looking in the future to get a rook lift going, which could be very beneficial, in the sake of attacking. We have b takes, or a takes on b5, and this is actually a mistake, because now after queen g4, you have a great way to continue an attack. Of course, the queen here on h3, because of the lack of bishop that you have, the queen doesn't really have the potential to attack anymore that easily, which is why, here black does a beautiful maneuver of the queen trying to get it into a more active position. And now, yep, the rook coming to f5 looking for checkmate. So overall, I mean, this just really highlights the possibilities to attack even when you don't necessarily have that much more material than your opponent. The rook comes to a4, stopping this from being checkmate. And then the truth is, after rook takes rook, king takes rook, and queen to e2, it's definitely time for white to resign, because you have to take the pawn. If you don't take, then obviously black promotes, trades off the pawn for the rook, and I mean, a queen against bishop ending is wonderful for you. So white took in this position, but then after queen takes, white did resign, because of course, I mean, there's no way that white's going to be able to win, even though, there are some dangerous passed pawns. And if this was a rook, for example, then maybe there would be the chance of white promoting. Here the queen's just going to be very quickly to grab all these pawns up, and it's going to end very quickly for white. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. It definitely highlighted some very important lessons. Firstly, if we look back, this powerful bishop, especially once you sacrifice the other bishop, and that's kind of why, having two bishops is so important. You can use one of them to attack very heavily, and the other one you can use more of a distraction, and maybe, you can use it kind of and gambit it away, and then use the other one. So just having two bishops on two very powerful diagonals is very pleasant for black here. So that's one huge lesson. You definitely want your bishops active, and you don't necessarily want to trade them. And also another lesson is, even when you don't have that much more material than your opponent, you still have a very good way to attack if your pieces are more active. So if you look at both of these pieces, they're not doing anything for white. This really is the only active piece, whereas this queen, this pawn, some maybe other pawns can come into the attack later, and of course this rook. Black has a lot more chances here. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned a little bit from it. Make sure you guys subscribe for more videos like these, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.